Welcome to the first Hume module. This is David Hume. What do we know about Hume?
He is British.
Yeah, Scottish, isn't he?
Scottish, yes.
Yeah.
Actually, very famous Scottishman.
Yeah.
And he is writing in response pretty much to our good friend John Locke.
Yep. 50 years afterwards.
Yeah, 50 years after. He's also kind of touching on some Descartes ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not actually a friend of Locke or Descartes. Well, he might have been a friend, but he's not a friend of their ideas. He's here to argue against them.
Yeah, and so I think it's good to mention that he's an empiricist and a skeptic.
Yep.
So the skeptic thing I find, both of those things I find pretty interesting. So skeptic means he doesn't believe things easily. Mm-hmm. He's skeptical. And this kind of links into the fact that he doesn't believe that there's any knowledge that we have that we're born with, which Descartes does believe that there's certain knowledge that we're born with.
Yeah.
A priori knowledge. So Descartes, for example, believes that we know that we exist.
Yeah.
We can know that through rationality.
Yeah.
Whereas Hume doesn't believe that. He believes that any knowledge that we have, we gain through our senses. I guess is kind of more like Armstrong in that way. He doesn't believe things easily. He doesn't believe in random ideas like God or the soul or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's the quote that the text starts with. Here, Hume is kind of setting up the belief that he's going to actually rebut throughout his whole text.
Yeah.
Right?
So this isn't what he thinks.
This is definitely not what he thinks. He's saying there's some philosophers, not him, who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourself.
Yeah.
So there are some people who believe that we have personal identity.
Yes, and so the self there is meaning personal identity.
Yeah.
And I think the conscious, how he says they're intimately conscious, so they're aware, they realise that's very much picking up on Locke's ideas, wouldn't you say?
Right, so maybe Locke is one of the philosophers he's referring to here. Locke believes that we are conscious of ourself.
Yeah, always. And that, if anything, that's what actually amounts to our personal identity, that chain of consciousness that we have. Yeah?
Indeed.
So as we mentioned, Hume very much disagrees with this, and what he ultimately is going to conclude is that there is no such thing as this idea of self. Okay, and has a bit of a complicated reasoning to get there, but very much he thinks that this idea of self is false. It's a construct. Yeah.
Yeah. What does a construct mean?
It means it is. Oh, that's a hard one to define.
I think it's like something that we make up.
Yeah. That we could imagine, or we just think is there to help us do something or to help us think another thing. So he's saying that we construct this idea of an identity to help us identify things.
Yeah, and just because we like to think that we have a personal identity.
Exactly. But do we actually have that identity? He's going to say no. We don't.
Interesting.
So here, Hume is introducing a key idea of his, which is impressions. Now, apparently impressions are a type of perception, which is something that we're going to look at. And you can kind of pretty much use them interchangeably. So, and at different times he's going to talk about perceptions, and at different times he talks about impressions. So what would you say you think an impression is, Ms. Fitz?
Is an impression the same thing as a perception?
Yeah. So what would you say either of those
Oh,
things
sorry.
are? Yeah.
Something that you experience with your senses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So your view of something happening. So whenever an event happens and we see it, we are perceiving that thing happening.
And we have an impression of it.
And that's leaving an impression on us.
So an impression could be a sight, or how something smells, or how something feels, like heat or cold or light or dark.
Yes. Yeah. So he's using this quote to pretty much say, and what the key thing you're going to take away from this, and it will eventually find its way into one of our mind maps, is that the idea of a self, so this thing that he's responding to, this idea of locks and others, must come from some impression. So here's his reason for that last idea we just looked at, that our self must be impressions. And basically there's a really quick little thought experiment. The students in my class have done it, but it's if you stop, so you could do it right now if you wanted to pause this, stop and try and figure out who you are. And
So close your eyes.
yeah, close your eyes, stop, and figure out exactly who you are. Okay, so pause it now and do that.
Or what you are. Like
what you are, yeah.
What part of...
What your identity is.
What part of you is you.
Yes, and how are you Joe or Sally or Bob? Okay, so stop, pause it, and do that. My kids, you know the answer to this, so you can keep going.
So the idea...
And so the answer, ultimately, is that, and this is what is...
So let me try to do it now, shall I?
There you go.
Okay. Closing my eyes, looking into my heart. I'm feeling my heart beat. And I've got a picture of myself in my mind, what I look like.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of remembering myself with my family.
Lovely.
Teaching my lovely philosophy class.
Oh dear.
Is this helping?
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Yep.
Okay, so this quote is referring to this exact process, and it's what he's referring to when he says, catch myself. And he's saying that I can never catch myself at any time without a perception. So all those things you just mentioned, having those memories of your family and teaching and whatever.
Images in my mind of myself.
Or images, yes. Mm-hmm. They are just really perceptions of those events and perceptions of you.
Yeah.
It's not really you knowing yourself. You don't know yourself. Like, it's like in that way. All it is your version of you thinking you're looking at you and you remembering that or picturing that or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so his point is you can never exist at any given moment without a perception.
Yeah.
Yep.
So whenever you try to figure out if you exist or figure out who you are, what your identity is, all you're going to be relying on are those perceptions. There's no greater kind of self beyond that.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's why he says the self must be an impression or a perception.
If there is an idea of personal identity, it must come from a perception.
Yeah.
Just as a little side note, the reason there's a picture of a lady sleeping here is because he says, if you have no perceptions, so for example, if you're completely asleep, not dreaming, I guess, or if when you die, the reason that you no longer exist is because you have no perceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Cool. So here he's basically just saying that, okay, so if yourself is a perception, or potentially a group of perceptions, if yourself is that thing, then that impression must be able to continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives. So he's basically saying it must be constant and invariable. Yeah, that particular perception. If it's going to be our self, it has to meet those requirements.
So he's not saying that there is a perception like that.
No.
He's just saying if there's a perception that we can say is our personal identity, it must be one that is that never changes. That is there throughout our entire lives.
And this is this is an important quote that we didn't have a chance to look at in class, so I want you to potentially highlight it. It's at the bottom of page 299 and goes on to 300.
So then I guess this is kind of premise 3 of his argument. He's already given 2 premises. So he said, what was his first premise?
So that the self, this idea of the self must be an impression.
If there is an idea of self, it must be from an impression.
Mm-hmm.
And then his second premise is it must be an impression that never changes.
Yep.
And then his third premise is there is no impression that never changes.
Yep.
So he gives these quite nice examples of all the different types of impressions that we experience in our lives that just succeed each other, as in they come after each other. None of them actually stays forever. So pleasure, and one moment we might be feeling pleasure, the next moment we might be feeling pain.
Yep.
One moment we might be feeling joy, the next we might be feeling grief. And that's why I put this picture here of all the different types of perceptions we could have. It's a bit of
really just funky, weird eyes.
Yeah, I know. I thought it was pretty though. So there's nothing that remains constant.
Pretty is a perception.
Your face is pretty.
I think it looks
pretty ugly.
Whoa.
Sorry.
Moving on. So, at the top here, we've got his key conclusion about the self. Well, part of his key conclusion. It cannot, therefore, be from any of these impressions, because none of them are constant or invariable, that the idea of self is derived, and consequently, there is no such idea.
There is no such idea of self.
Yep. And instead, this is all we get, kind of. In the way of his ultimate theory, this is probably the best we get.
Mm-hmm.
In that it is, I mean like the best we get in terms of his theory of what our identity is.
So he doesn't really give a theory of personal identity like Locke does.
No.
Because he doesn't believe personal identity exists.
No. And he says instead all we've got is, and that's why he says, we're nothing but a bundle of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity.
As in unbelievably fast.
Yes.
They succeed.
All we've got is these perceptions. He wouldn't go and give that bundle an identity, he's saying that is all we are.
This is actually a really famous thing, the bundle theory of personal identity. So there's no... If you imagine a bundle of sticks, just all these sticks like tied together, there's not one of them that necessarily sums up the identity of the whole thing.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, it's just
good.
all these different parts. None of them are constant.
Yeah. All of them are just single perceptions.
Yeah.
No whole. So he provides quite a lovely analogy of this idea of the bundle of different perceptions. And he basically says that potentially our mind could be like a theatre in that you could think of it as a movie theatre or a theatre where there's a stage theatre, where there's plays and stuff, where all our different perceptions kind of just play out one after the other. It's just this constant experience of perceptions slash
it's
things
pretty
on the
nice
screen slash stage. It's quite lovely.
It's a nice analogy,
So
isn't it, Elise?
As we're walking around in our day-to-day lives, it's just kind of like we're at the movies, and it's just all playing out in front of us.
So what's the point? Why does he raise that?
To say that, to highlight that there's no like fixed thing that we are or that we're experiencing. Like
it's all just playing out on a stage.
It's just playing out. We're just perceiving the playing out stuff. That is what he's saying.
So I guess some people might say, in response to that analogy, that, okay, so the mind is like a theatre where there's all sorts of scenes being played out. The scenes are our perceptions.
Yes.
Some people might say, well, there's one constant thing in that. Okay, so all the scenes always change, just like our perceptions, but the theatre always stays the same.
Yes.
And so they might make an analogy between that and the mind and say, well, yeah, maybe all our perceptions always change, but our mind is always there and always remains the same.
Yes.
And therefore doesn't the mind constitute our personal identity? Like same mind theory or something like that.
Yeah. And he's saying, no, you're doing something that I'm going to accuse you of very soon, which is you're just putting a construct onto this thing this analogy I've just created, and leaping onto it as some security, saying, there's my identity. Where really he's saying, no, all I'm saying is that there's this series of perceptions, okay, that are running. You're trying to create something, like, say, a theatre or a mind or an identity, to hold those all together. And I'm saying there is no such thing as that. All we have is our perceptions.
Yeah.
All that is all the mind is.
Because we can't look into our heads and say, oh, there's the mind.
Yes.
All we can see are our perceptions.
Yes, all we can experience.
All we can experience are our perceptions. So we can't assume that there's some constant mind that's holding these perceptions together.
Yeah.
That would just be wrong. He's being skeptical.